Hey, welcome back to the Seven Figure Music School podcast. Nate and I are going to be talking about another important topic for music school owners today, and that is raising rates. You ready to go on this, Nate?
Yes, we get questions about raising rates, when, why, how, all the time.
Yes. However, I want to lead off with a piece of information and data that is likely unknown to 99% of music school owners out there, although they might personally feel this way. And here's what I mean. I've done a lot of research, studied, doing surveys, having conversations with school owners, and I found out something very interesting about this whole topic of raising rates. I think we all know, like, in general, we probably need to do it every year because of inflation and things like that. But I discovered something this past year that I didn't know, and it was this. Apparently, one of the go-to tools in the tool bag of a lot of business coaches out there, or music school or music studio owner support groups, whether it's free or paid. Apparently, one of the very first tools that the admin or the owner of that coaching program pulls out is, "Hey, you want to grow? Raise your rates." And I actually found that there was a lot of personal frustration with this advice from school owners, because apparently this point gets hammered over and over and over again, like it is the end all be all piece of advice for growing one's income or being able to grow the school, that sort of thing. So I want to acknowledge that right here at the beginning of the episode, because we're going to take a different approach to this. This is not just this hammer that we're going to bang on like, oh yeah, the real easy way to make more money is just to raise the rates. There's a lot of subtleties, a lot of shades, a lot of nuances to this. And I just want to acknowledge that at the beginning, because it can be very easy from, again, from the research, it can be very easy for a school owner to hear this and just kind of roll their eyes and be like, "Oh, heard that before." So hope I didn't drop too much of a bomb on there, on you there, Nate. But I wanna be cognizant of this fact as we go into this topic.
Yeah, well, it's. I'm glad you shared it. We were talking about before hitting record that there's such a common misconception that all we need to do is fix one or two things in our school and everything will be better. In this case, as you pointed out, all you need to do is coach someone to raise their rates, and that's the silver bullet. It's just not. It's actually, first of all, there are no silver bullets, as we all know. For those of us that
Love
have
it.
been in the business for a long time,
Yes.
there are no silver bullets. And number two, yeah, the perspective we're going to take is, how do you just build it into bucket number three, your operations, your financial fluency, and how do you just systemize your pricing? Price increases, raising rates. It's not an emotional issue. It's a really just one that you can be very pragmatic about.
Interesting. So ideally, it's not an emotional issue. My experience tells me,
Yeah.
and I'm just gonna say, within the last 2 weeks, I was talking a music school owner who has a 200 plus kid school through their first rate raise in a
Mhm.
while, and all of the attending emotions and confusions and how do I do this type questions that on the surface it could just seem like, oh, raise rates, do that. But it is an emotional topic sometimes for
Yeah.
people. So I want to acknowledge that too. I'm not disputing what you said there, Nate. What I'm hearing you say, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is it doesn't have to be an emotional topic. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And so the
Okay.
resistance to all of us raising rates, and mind you, we've had this within BMF. This isn't like I'm sorry, I'm not, by no means, if you're listening, please assume that like we had just figured this out and checked that box and moved on with life. No, of course, like we were right there with all of you cats, just feeling this like, well, what happens if we raise the rates? And so why does it get emotional? It gets emotional because it's we're living in fear. What are we
Mm,
fearing? We're fearing that we're going to lose customers, right?
mm,
That's the number one fear.
mm.
We're fearing that we will lose new inquiries. That's the number two fear,
Yeah.
right? Reduction in leads. People will be like, that's now become an expensive program, right? So it's a fear based, we get emotional when we're living in fear there. And I just, today we're just going to talk about ways to deal with that and then
Okay.
move beyond the fear and into a more systematic approach to it.
Okay. Could I lead off with a big picture question then?
Yeah, yeah, fire.
I'm just going out on a limb here, but other than some of the cookie cutter advice that we were kind of referencing earlier, why does BMF raise rates? Why would any music school owner raise their rates? What would be if there's something to lose there? Why do it? And I'm wondering if there's something beneath the surface, a non-obvious answer that you have, Nate. I'm curious.
I think the most basic answer you said, we all sort of understand inflation, et cetera.
Hmm.
But in truth, we don't really. Most music school owners are not macroeconomics people.
Oh,
They're not thinking
interesting.
about the fact that a couple of issues here. Why do we raise rates at BMF? Because the cost of doing business is increasing every single year. It costs more for that insurance. It costs more for that electricity. That is the definition of inflation. Okay, inflation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's what happens naturally, 3%-ish, right?
Yeah.
So in order for me to operate Brooklyn Music Factory, in order for us to show up and turn on the lights and heat the joint, cool the joint down,
In the
insure
summer.
everything,
Yeah.
blah, 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 all these things, you have to raise at least the rate of all of the operation costs are raising around you, right? At least you have to raise 3% because otherwise what you're doing is you're actually offering a lower cost lesson, a lower cost lesson, a lower cost lesson
Over time.
over time. The second
Yeah.
thing I'll say is that when we talk about running a profitable business, one of the common misconceptions is we want to make more money and put that money in the pockets of the owners, right? We're just like, we're trying to maximize, I'm trying to maximize cash for Nate or my partner, Brooklyn Music Factory.
Right.
This is not what we're talking about. Of course, you need to understand your own personal financial well-being and support that. Your business, your school should absolutely support that. However, we are raising rates in part to make sure that we are staying profitable so that we have capital to reinvest into our school and improve elements of our school. That's the second reason. We can reinvest in our teachers, right? Your teachers should absolutely see a pathway, as we've talked about before,
Yes.
to raises over time. They should know that their own financial well-being is being thought about,
Yes.
right? And so raising rates is giving you that extra cash so that you can invest in what matters to you at your school.
Yeah, and I think this is. I'm not going to take too much of a time out here, but I think of the recent episode we recorded about what do you do when a teacher asks for a raise? I mean, you can't give that raise if you don't have those financial resources available. I mean, I know that's a pretty obvious point, but all this stuff is connected.
It's such a good point. It is all connected. That's what we mean when we talk about financial fluency too, in that third bucket, is seeing the connection.
So Nate, does it, and I'm not trying to bait you here, but does it really just come down to economic factors? Is there nothing hidden or secret beneath the surface as to why we might also want to raise rates? In other words, is it just this simple and we can move on?
It's pretty simple, Daniel, in my experience. I mean, I've only been doing it here at the factory for 13 years, but I want to get into how we do it to try to help people and make sure they walk away with a few concrete steps to improve that third bucket, their financial fluency in their operations. But it's pretty simple. I basically ask myself two questions. Number one, we have a set net income, a set profitability that we're always trying to achieve on average every year. And so am I on target to do that with the current price and then the forecasted price for our private lessons and for our group classes? So number one, ask yourself, are you actually just increasing rates to at least to match inflation? So just put it at 3%. If I think a safe number that's been taught to me is 5%. So just 5%. And then number two, do you have any large projects that you need to invest in to improve and add value for your families, right? So for example, at Brooklyn Music Factory, since we are always developing curriculum, I have to look at pricing and say, if I increase the price, for example, of the mini keys or the Jam 101 program serving our ages 4 to 8, will that give me more capital to then invest in improving the curriculum for those families, for those students? So that's the second part of it. It's not purely just matching inflation and adding a percent or two on top. It's also saying, where do you want to invest in the future? What do you want to invest in? And one way to generate that capital to invest is through doing a different type of price increase, maybe above inflation. So, for example, that's a very real thing that we did with Mini Keys and Jam Band recently. We said we really, really want to improve the curriculum around that age range. It was already strong, but we wanted to take it all the way to to being, some of the best in the world. And so we needed capital to do it. I could go into debt to do it, but instead we decided to do a 10% price increase there, right? To generate a little bit more cash that's going to be reinvested right back into the family experience, into the student experience. Okay, so I think that answers that question.
Yeah, for sure. And something you said something in there that was interesting to me. You kind of said, "Hey, we're going to get into the how we do this," and I have some thoughts around that too. But there's maybe before we jump into that, there's a thought that I have, something that a mentor of mine told me. He said that too often we over-identify with the pricing around our products. We take it very personally. And I imagine the more we have invested into it, the more we take those numbers personally. Other thing too is that they've done studies over time and shown that people psychologically latch onto certain numbers and start to build a story in their head around those numbers. I know personally for me, and this was many, many years ago, this, I think, even now in the Midwest where I'm located, this price would be way too low. But at the time, this was the highest price point in my area. I had a real hard time imagining going over the $97 mark for a month of lessons. Again, Midwest, many years ago, highest price in my area. And I thought breaking that 100 barrier, it felt weird to me. And it's just that psychological hesitancy, internal roadblock, if you will. Well, the advice that was given to me was, imagine you go out to a restaurant and the waiter or the waitress comes up and you ask them, "What's the best thing on the menu?" And they point it out to you on the menu. You see it and it's very expensive. Does that waiter or waitress start getting nervous about telling you the price of the New York strip? Oh man, I wonder if they're going to accept this price. Of course not. They have no emotion on that price. They're literally just reporting the number to you. They're pointing it out. Maybe the owner of the restaurant does, but for him, he has hard costs on it, and he's probably he or she are probably making very small margins on whatever the best item or most expensive item on the menu is. And what my mentor said to me is that so often as service providers, we over-identify with that number, and really the way around it is to think of ourselves as the waiter or the waitress, and to just simply report the number without thought, without emotion, just as that person would.
Yeah.
Very helpful and timely advice for me. What were you going to say, Nate?
Well, and I love that story because the owner's nowhere there. I mean, maybe the owner's the chef, so she's back in the kitchen, right? But at some point, she did the analysis that we're about to walk through to try to deal with our pricing on lessons and classes, and she said this steak is absolutely worth it for these reasons. Number one, this is what it costs to actually buy the thing. But number two, this is what it costs to have all of these great, my sous chef, me, but this is what it costs to operate the thing. And I'm going to put together a formula that works for me that says this is the value.
Absolutely. And Nate, what you're saying resonates so much to me because of that financial fluency piece again. If we don't, so many people I think would have so much less hesitancy over a rate raise, or so much less emotion on that number if they personally, as the owner, or co-owner knew everything that went into arriving at that number, if they truly knew what it cost to run the business, it would seem like this is necessary. This is necessary. Like it's almost like this is an inevitability. We have to do this, or we can't operate. You know, there are things that I've done because I have children now that I would not have done or ever considered doing prior to that. And it's just like, oh, okay, this just dropped into my lap. Or, you know, things going on with my parents health wise, they're getting up there in years. I will drop things that I have to do for the business because I need to be there for my parents. It's just like, oh, it's an inevitability.
Yeah.
Like almost all emotion goes out. You just do the thing because you have to.
Yeah.
And I think that can show up for someone when they're so much more connected to some of these deeper things in the business that, let's be honest, when we're not fully taking responsibility for our role, we can tend to ignore the things that sometimes we feel guilty about: keeping track of metrics, having a mission statement, keeping a cash flow report, those sorts of things. So
Yeah.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just what you said earlier. Everything is linked, and we don't. But as you know, CEOs, as owners, making choices right now, we don't want to get overwhelmed by what we don't know yet. We want to just act on what we do know, and then, Daniel, you hit it on the head. Recognize that there is a list of items in bucket number 3 around operations and financial fluency that we're just still working on.
Yeah.
You know, we work with all sorts of different music school owners, and everybody has knowledge in different buckets. Some people are really, really good at sales and really poor with their financial fluency and their metrics. We have others. We're working with someone now who's just, I mean, so well organized in bucket number 3 and not as strong in bucket number 2 on delivery of service and training and that kind of thing. And it's just fascinating. So we don't want to get overwhelmed, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we leave and act on what we think is important. And this is a really important one. And once we set it, I think we should dive into, you know, how we do it at Brooklyn Music Factory, but also how you've done it at Grow. And I think it's time to dive into the how.
Yeah.
You know, because once we can figure out that there's a system we can visit annually around pricing, then it becomes less overwhelming. Just like, dig it. It reminds me of the episode we did on what to do when a teacher asks for a raise. Yeah. And I thought one of the most important points we made there was like, you want to be prepared. And by the way, you don't need to have this conversation more than once a year.
Yeah.
It's not like you don't need to live in fear that every 3 months, because it's totally inappropriate that an employee would come to you every 3 months. You don't have to.
Yeah.
Once a year. Okay. Yeah. So same with pricing.
So right before we jump into that how, Nate.
Yeah.
So hold that thought. Just the last thought I want to give on this, or observation I want to make about what you just said there is, yes, we have different areas of skill around the different areas or the buckets of business. And this is where I want to maybe jump in with this thought of the distinction between information and acting on that information. Simply having the information versus acting on it. Because I get an awful lot. I mean, literally, again, another conversation I had this month where I was telling someone, yeah, you kind of have to do this. If you want to get to the revenue number that you're saying you want to get to, you have to do this. And this particular client had some serious pushback. I really don't want to have to do that. Like, my idea of getting to my goals is not having to do that thing there. Like, in other words, it's like if I have to keep a cash flow statement, that's not what this particular person said, but it's the same energy. If I have to keep a cash flow statement, I've lost. I don't want to have to do that. And so I think this comes down to the place that, again, that distinction between information and action and coaching, which is, this is where sometimes it can be, this is definitely where it's helpful to have a mentor, where you can kind of work through those thoughts, because what our work together now is centering around is, okay, well, what do you want out of this? Why is it that you want to avoid this thing? you say you want to drive a car, but you don't want to put gas in it. Do you really want to drive a car, actually? I mean, that sounds silly, but to me, some of these things that are critical to run a business, especially one that's in mid, high 6 figures, 7 figures, there are just some things that have to be done. And if the emotion isn't there, the motivation isn't there, that's where having accountability, mentorship, someone to walk you through this, can be helpful. Because, and I'll end with this thought, not the episode, but my thought, I'll end the thought here, that there are things that I really resisted doing years ago that I actually enjoy now. And I enjoy doing that work each month, where 5 years ago, I really railed internally against having to do it. Oh, just another thing for me to have to do. So I just want to put that there before we go into the how, because the how to raise rates is one conversation, but what we were just touching on is that deeper thing that drives all of this, the thing that makes it possible to grow a school or business of this size, which is some of the habits and things that have to be done to make this happen. So I just thought I'd mention that. So Nate, what about the how? Tell me what you're thinking.
Diving into the how, love it. So first of all, understand it's an annual rhythm, right? That you just literally, like, what matters gets on your calendar. That's we all basically know that. Whether we use that habit, whether we operate that way or not, if it matters to us, we put it on the calendar. So things show up on my calendar that are annual. Things show up on my calendar that are quarterly. Things show up on my calendar every single week, So step one, like, just pause the podcast and make a calendar reminder for you right now that you are going to develop and implement a pricing strategy. Like, you need a few hours if you've never done it. Okay? So that's number one. You're going to have to make time for it. Number two, and this, I didn't do this initially. Again, all of these things, like, let's be clear, Daniel, as you mentioned, you need someone to show you, and then you need someone to inspire you, help you work through the blocks.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that when you're talking about a mentor or a coach, like, I had the books,
interesting,
but I also needed the mentor to be like, okay, Nate, I'm holding you accountable to doing the work, and then I'm available to you for asking questions. So I had that. I built my version of a pricing strategy and method, and then I went to my coach, or I went to, if you can't afford a coach, at least get yourself a group of small business owners that you know and trust, and bring it to them. Like that, you should have that anyways, because you're going to need it for the rest of your career. But at any rate, so you book the time. Second thing you're going to do is you're going to do simple market research. You talked about this before, Daniel, and we've talked about this around, teacher rates and staff rates in a previous episode. You're just going to go look at 3 to 5 competitors in your area, and you're going to say, What are they charging? And you're going to do it, and you're going to put this on a freaking spreadsheet. It's not complicated. It'll take you 30 minutes on the Googleplex. You just start Googling the schools. If they don't advertise their rates, you pick up the phone and you call them and you pretend you're enrolling in their program.
Ooh.
Yeah. So you
secret shopping.
Yeah, you do it. And secret shopping. And so then we'll take the 30-minute piano lesson as an example. So then you've just got 5 schools, and those 5 schools all charge between, $25 and $70 for a 30-minute piano lesson. You're just looking for an average or a mean. You're just saying, like, okay, the average in my market is around $46 for a 30-minute lesson. You look at what you're currently charging. So that's the other thing. And this is fascinating to me, okay, Daniel, around pricing, is that we will talk to school owners that don't actually know what they charge.
Yeah.
Which is mind-blowing, because it's not actually mind-blowing. I understand it, because we're so focused on just getting through a day. We're like, well, but I have to teach like 12 lessons in the next 2 days. I don't have time to actually look at my rates. I can't remember. And
The
so,
other one go
yeah,
ahead, go ahead.
no, fire.
The other thing I see too is that people don't, and there's nothing wrong with this, but people aren't even sure what they're bringing in each month because they charge in a non-traditional way. Like, for instance, here's an easy one: they'll charge by the semester, so they get this influx of cash at the beginning of the semester, or they charge a yearly schedule, but they break it out over 10 months. And I'll say, what do you bring in a single month? What's the number? Oh, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? So yeah, there's a number of different ways. I think more than just they're not paying attention. It could be just there's an opacity to it. It's kind of opaque. It's almost like a black box. People aren't exactly sure what it is. Like, they're charging a good rate, but they can't tell me in a given month, other than to look at maybe the bank statement if they do that at the end of the month to see what it is.
Yeah, and so this gets back to the comment around linking. It also gets back to the comment around financial fluency. Please don't get overwhelmed if you're like, I'm one of those people. Instead, just recognize that in bucket number 3, there's a financial fluency piece that's an opportunity for you in 2022 or whenever you're listening to this. Say like, hey, I could actually level that game up, right? And so, Daniel, to what I hear in that last comment that I think is so valuable to link straight to this pricing is that if we cannot set pricing and be able to forecast, for example, monthly income that we can then spread out over 10 or 12 months for annual income, if we can't see the link from a 30-minute lesson forecasted out to monthly income, forecasted out to annual revenue, then we get reactive. We just think we need to sell
Yes.
more, and more, because that's the only solution. We can't actually understand the flow of cash from a 30-minute lesson to annual revenue. We can't see the link yet, so then everything becomes reactive, and it's just like, people are leaving. I need to sell more. Now I need to hire more. Everything becomes like a snowball effect.
Now, I imagine for a smaller studio or a single teacher studio that there might be a degree of disconnect with what we're saying here, but there is not for the mid and large size school. And the reason for that is that the number of programs, the number of instruments, the number of different price points across those programs can make forecasting a challenge and an actual task that needs to happen. Because for me, I ran a very simple program, had about 100 kids in it. I literally just took the number of kids that were enrolled and multiplied by one number, and I knew what it was going to be. Not so easy for a bigger school. So for the owner of a larger or mid-sized school, you're hearing this and you're really connecting. But if you have a smaller school, there might be a little bit of a disconnect here. But you have an opportunity in that disconnect.
Yes.
If you start doing this now, that habit is what is going to actually create the pathway to becoming larger. And so much better to have that habit instilled now when it's easy. And, you're in the primer level or the level 1 right now. Better to have those good practice habits in now than have to get to being intermediate and having to relearn some things.
That's such a good point, Daniel. And those, lay the foundation. Lay the foundation. So can I just actually read you top to bottom our pricing chart? So let's say now you've booked time to create your pricing. And I'm going to tell you, the Brooklyn Music Factory will serve, in 2022, will serve 500 students plus another 400 or 500 in camps and, I don't know, a bunch of birthday parties. Okay, so
Before we do that, before we go there, did we finish the process by which you all do the pricing increase?
I'm step 2 on the process right here.
Okay,
You're literally
perfection.
going to make a spreadsheet top to bottom, and it just says what you provide. So I'm assuming you provide some private lessons. I'm assuming you have 1 or 2 group classes. That's the Brooklyn Music Factory model, right? So our pricing sheet has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines on it. 7 if you count camp. That's it. It's a 7-line spreadsheet. It goes 30-minute private lesson, 45-minute private lesson, 60-minute private lesson. Doesn't matter what instrument you are. Doesn't matter what teacher you're with. It's the same, right? Then we go to our group class program. We have Song Lab, which is our adult songwriter program. We have our group class programs, Club Keyboard, Mini Keys, Jam Band 101. They're all priced the same, right? Simplicity
Mm.
leads to systemization, right? You need to be able to keep your life simple if you're going to build financial fluency, if you're going to start to build operations. So we used to be more complicated around pricing. We learned the hard way. Just simplify your pricing and make sure that every service you offer as high a value as possible to back up the pricing. So let me get to the very last two lines. Then we have our advanced bands, which we call our position bands. Those are for our teens. Those are those songwriting bands. They are a longer program. They're a 90-minute session. They're a different price point. And then finally, we have camp. Camp is just a day camp price and a week camp price. And you guess what the week camp price is? 5 times the day camp price. It's very basic. We're not getting all fancy, you know. So step 2 is you just simply make your spreadsheet. And maybe what we'll put in our resources we can put a little sample of a BMF one, make it really easy for people. So we can, if you want one of those, email us. I'll send it to you. Okay, so that's step 2. Step 3 is you're going to compare what the market is charging to what you're currently charging. And you're going to come up, and this is key, with a percentile difference. So let's say you charge, $50 for a 30-minute private lesson, and the market charges, $60 for a 30-minute private lesson. What is the difference in those two rates? In other words, what do you got?
16.6%.
So you're 16. Thank you. You're round that sucker up 17% under the market. Right? Okay, fair enough. Now you've got some real data to work with. Notice how it's getting less emotional. Okay? Now, of course, you're comparing what you offer to what they offer. You're comparing things like, do you think you're a higher value 30-minute private lesson? Are you a more unique program? Is your demand higher? There's some other issues that go into it. But the science of pricing versus the art of pricing, right? The science is you need to have the information on a simple spreadsheet that you can look at. Now, the next thing you're going to do is very simple. You're going to raise everything by 5% in your program for the next. We do it seasonally. We do it in the fall. So we follow the school calendar, not the fiscal calendar. So we raise for the fall. We do our pricing. Here's a good task you can do right now. Book on your calendar your pricing review for April. So set your prices for the next fall by May so that when you're re-enrolling to the fall, all of that email, all of the messaging already has the new pricing on it. Okay, can I just give one fun fact to that?
Please.
That was actually a little bit of a operational dropping of science right there for those of you that are taking notes. You're pricing in April, and you're not even introducing the price increase for another 4 or 5 months. But you're messaging your re-enrollment with the new cost in May, still months before the students are going to have that new cost on there. And here's the little fun fact in our experience at BMF. Very, very, very few families will even comment.
Yes.
Okay, so we can get to that maybe later in this episode if we've got time. But okay, so now you've done an increase of 5% of your products. You're then going to compare when you do an increase of 5% to what the market was charging. And what's the differential then? So basically, the final part of the formula we'll share is this, is that if your rates are still within 10 to 20% of the competition, you're doing fine. So you raise it by 5%, you stay within that margin. And then basically, between you and I, Daniel, I don't give it a whole lot of thought beyond that. That's it. Nate's done. And at this
Well,
point, I take 30 minutes in April. And then I'm going to get to the last step, which is an important one around your team. But anyways, any thoughts at this point? That was kind of a lot of steps and some
I
data.
have a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts.
What do you got? I see you're taking notes. What do you
Yeah,
got?
literally, I have so many. I was starting to write them down
I know. What do you
because
got?
I knew I'd forget them. Um, okay, first off, there was a American industrialist back when America's economy was more around manufacturing. So we're
Mm.
talking like 70, 80 years ago. His name was W. Edwards Deming. Two quotes that are incredibly important to me came to mind as I heard you describing that process. One of those quotes is, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. This is a quote from this guy, and he revolutionized manufacturing in the 1950s in the United States, and has kind of gone down as one of the business titans that no one has heard of the 1900s. Just to hear you describe this so dispassionately, so expertly, what it tells me is, I mean, other than the obvious, you know what you're doing, but there is a systematic nature to this. The second quote of his is, "It is not enough to do your best. You must know what to do and then do your best." And I think that gets down to the research you do around, well, what was the inflation rate this year? What are other people charging? What do we need to bring in this year to cover costs? And I think this also goes down to the second point I wanted to make, the reason why it only takes you 30 minutes in April, because it is supported by a number of other habits that you're doing throughout the year and metrics you're tracking, so that you kind of have all that stuff just sitting in front of you, and then you can just make a decision, and you realize, again, without a lot of emotion, kind of dispassionately, oh, well, that's the number we need to be at.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Sir.
I want to highlight something here. We're talking right now, dude, and I'm just searching in our Google Drive. I'm like
Mm-hmm.
pricing 2122 and pulling up the sheet. And there it is. And it's a very simple sheet. And
Yeah.
it's been in existence for, I don't know, 6, 7 years since maybe we were taught how to do it. And I took the time to try to build something. And so, yeah, it's, I I implore those that are listening to choose only a few things right now that you're going to implement. But if one of them you do is pricing, you will have, you'll be so grateful 2 or 3 Aprils from now that you have
Yes.
a system. Okay, can we go to the next? Oh, wait, no.
Oh,
What do you got? And then I want to
that
take.
was only the second out of five thoughts that I had.
Okay,
The
continue. What do you got?
the third thought, just as you were speaking, and you actually led into it really nicely there with that thought that you had, is that idea around price complexity. I mentioned a client that I was working with recently, and part of what made the process so difficult for the school owner was, again, they had a number of different students across a number of different programs, and even within some of the simpler programs, there were multiple rates. There were
Mhm.
multiple special deals that this particular person had across the school. It was a nightmare. If this So a lot of the questions that were coming to me and the support that I was offering the school owner just had to do around with untangling this whole mess. And that's where, again, mentorship and having someone to work through this, because again, Nate just described a simple process. It probably didn't feel as simple to him 6 or 7 years ago, and there was someone that you kind of relied on to help you make it work for you. So that's the third thought. And the fourth thought, which is the idea that getting a coach or a mentor or something like that to walk through this, help untangle the mess, help to get some transparency around these numbers, to walk through the numbers, to set these systems up, can be really helpful. And just a fifth and very brief thought, I think I'll throw this in the show notes, but about 5 years ago, I wrote a blog post on raising rates. I
Mm.
think we can just throw the link in there. Um, and, you know, it's not going to be one size fits all, but it is a really good template or framework for a simple system for announcing that change, that one very specific part of the process. Here's how you announce the change to your families. And I even give an email template in there. To this day, I wrote this, I think, in 2017. To this day, I still get emails from people saying, I use that template. It worked really, really well. I give a really simple formula and an evidence-backed reasoning for why I write it the way that I do and how I announce it the way that I do and why it never caused any problems in my studio. So a lot of that nervousness and emotion that people feel is around, oh, what if the parents reject the price? I just found that this particular way of announcing that price increase, if you use this exact template, it'll do wonders for you no matter what size your school is. And even some of the private clients I see, they'll run and they told me, hey, I use that template still. It's really, really helpful. So we can throw that link in the show notes.
Love that.
That we put on, our podcast page and on our YouTube channel and all that sort of thing. So those are my 5 thoughts, Nate.
I think, can I highlight 2 things I heard there, and then I want to move, and it segues perfectly to the closing, some closing thoughts on this. First of all, you highlighted pricing complexity and discounts. At Brooklyn Music Factory, we offer a family discount for multiple enrollments of 5%. That's it. There's a 5% off for multiple enrollment family discount. There's a 5% off if you prepay for the whole year. We could talk in another episode around cash flow and why you might be like, but dude, you just increased your price by 5% and now you're reducing it by 5%. Aren't you back where you started? That's a different episode. That's a financial fluency cash flow episode. That's a retention episode. But your family that has 3 kids and the dad taking lessons, yes, they get 5% off for a whole host of reasons. But at any rate, so that's how simple it is for us around discounts. Okay, just 5% off if you a multiple enrollment in the family, 5% off if you prepay. Okay, dig it. Wanted to just point out what we do at BMF. Second thing you talked about is how do you message afterwards, and I love that you have a template that people can go to. I think that's so badass. And I want to point out a couple things that BMF does. Okay, first of all, let me talk about going into the food co-op where I shop for my food and buy this Satsumo orange with leaves on it. The price on this thing changes week to week. Right? It was $2.72 a pound, and then it was $3.17 a pound this week. Right? Did anybody send me an email to explain? Did this farmer send me an email to explain the price differential week to week on this orange? No.
Probably not. Looks good, though.
It's really good. Satsumo. Okay, comes from California. Okay, now, at BMF, we no longer message price changes. Because we just think of us as a farmer. We just have operational costs. Things change. We just move from season to season. The camp price just went from $6.95 a week to $7.30 a week. Or maybe I think it's $7.30. We didn't send an email explaining why the price went up.
Yeah.
So I think this gets back to our emotional issue.
Yes.
So the template you're talking about can be highly valuable if you're like many schools where you have been afraid to raise rates for years. And like we just worked with the school to get her to raise her rates after 5 years. Right? So in that case, yeah, you're going to want a message. And you're going to want to message effectively like Daniel, you just pointed out. You're going to want to say, evidence back, this is why we're raising our rates. You can say, we haven't raised our rates in 5 years. We're raising them by 10% so that we can pay our teachers more, so that we can cover the cost of insurance and electricity, and so that we can give you the best possible experience for years to come. You should absolutely come up with a messaging campaign around that. But if you're raising your rates every year, pragmatically, like I'm describing, you do not need to message. You just simply operate a really highly valuable school for your families, and you do it intentionally year after year after year.
Yeah.
Right? So I just wanted to make that point there.
Yeah, and I actually don't think there's any I don't think there's any difference between our opinion. Because one of the things I highlight in that blog post that I referenced
Mm.
was that we're just going to let them know as an informational piece so that they can do their financial planning for their budget.
Nice.
It's a very, there's no reasoning behind it. It's almost like a footnote on, and when you see the template, you'll understand there's kind of a little bit of a strategy to it, but
Love
most of
that.
the reason I even give a strategy is just to help school owners overcome the emotional part that they're experiencing. For me, uh, in my own studio, I didn't even actually use the entire method that I give to other folks because I just didn't care. If people quit, okay, whatever. But no one ever did. And I once raised my rates 23% from one month to the next.
Wow, dig it.
Yeah. And heck, maybe that's a whole other podcast episode in of itself. But yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I don't think there's any. I can't find the word today, Nate. I don't know what's going on with me. Um, I don't think there's an argument that we would have between the way you do it and the way that I do it. I think that it just needs to be done. A little bit of ripping the Band-Aid, and I think it comes back full circle to the waiter or the waitress. You mentioned it. The farmer's market doesn't send you an email about the orange. The steakhouse doesn't send you an email being like, "Oh, the New York strip went from 55 to 62." Just wanted to let you know before you come in the next time. The
Right.
waiter or waitress doesn't come knocking on your door and tell you that. So yeah, just eliminate that emotional piece. A lot of this follows, and I think this whole episode has been about how to do this in a systematic, process-oriented way, treating it like treating things professionally, doing things professionally, so that this is just yet another thing we do each year. I think the footnote that I would add, not that we're ending here, because you might have something to add. The footnote that I would add would be that since this is an operations bucket item,
Mm-hmm.
write out this process, even if it's simple. Write out, okay, in April, I'm going to do this each year. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Put it in a text file. Put it in your Evernote. Put it in your Google Drive, like wherever you keep documents for your studio, because I'm sure you have them. Put that in there. Put it on your calendar. On the calendar item, say, check this particular folder so you remember what the process is. Because a lot of times, even to this day, yearly processes, I'll get back to that process and I'll kind of forget the steps.
Yep.
And there's this internal block to doing it simply because I've kind of forgotten what I was supposed to do. So having written it out, and then each year it gets more robust. Like I'll kind of try to get leverage on myself. I'll go through it in a particular year and be like, ooh, this part felt yucky to me. And so I'll even leave a note in a document like that where I'll say, hey, this part felt kind of, bad, but this is how I mitigated that. Don't forget this for next year. Do
Totally.
this. Yeah.
But this brings me, Daniel, to my closing thought, which is
Cool.
that how do you know if you're doing this well years from now? You know if you're doing this well because you're not doing it,
Mm.
right? So you're building a team that you trust with the process you're describing, Daniel, that's able to raise the rates on their own and do it in a systematic and thoughtful way. So, for example, at BMF, when I said the camp rates went from this to this, I didn't do that analysis. Hillary did it, and
Hmm.
my partner did it. And they just said, like, this is what's happening. The rates are going up to there. When we do price increases for our private lessons, again, I send it over to Hillary, who does billing and handles all of the collections. And I just say, hey, let's do a price increase. What do you think? It's that time of the year. And so because in my role I'm CFO, I'm always, my most important job, and yours probably too, is don't run out of money, make sure everyone gets paid, right? So of course I'm looking at it as part of the process, but you can absolutely get to a point where you trust your process. It's not an emotional thing. It's not like only you could possibly raise a rate because it's so dangerous to raise rates. No, you can get to the point where you trust the process, you trust your team, and you trust your annual system to do it.